Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring Key Data and Findings from the 2018 Columbus Survey. For those of you who are returning webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're so glad that you're here today. My name is Elizabeth Civetta, Program Associate here at Candid, based in New York City, and I'll be supporting today's webinar by collecting the questions that you ask along the way and posing them during our Q&A. I'd also like to go over a few items so you know how to take part in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something similar on your screen. By default, you're listening in using your computer's audio. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call to view the dial-in information. You can also type in your questions into the control panel at any time. As I mentioned, I'll be collecting these and posing them at the end of today's presentation. We'll also send out a follow-up email tomorrow, which will link to a recording of this webinar, as well as any links that are relevant to today's findings. I would now like to turn the controls over to my colleague, David Rosado, Director of CF Insights.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is David Rosado, the Director of CF Insights here at Candid, and we have a whole lot to talk about. We're going to be, for the most part, focusing on the results of our latest Columbus Survey of Community Foundations, which will be covering or reflecting fiscal year 2018 data that we recently collected from many of you on today's call or on today's webinar. But before I dive in, I'd just like to take a quick moment to note that CF Insights is now a service of Candid, a new organization that was formed when Foundation Center and GuideStar joined forces earlier this year, this past February. And together we bring over 88 years of experience to the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector by the sector. With Candid, nonprofits, foundations, donors, and the public can all be on the same page. And through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world to the resources they need to do it. So this, of course, includes the audience of community foundations, which brings me to CF Insights. With CF Insights, we ask a very simple question, but I think an important one. What if each community foundation could know what all community foundations collectively know? And we do that by maintaining a shared knowledge platform that's supported by community foundations for community foundations. And through this platform and through this database, we offer data, benchmarking tools, and direct support like consulting to help inform important decisions about your community foundation's operating model. These decisions could be about fees, about your staffing structure, and other internal processes, just to name a couple of these different examples. So, what is the Columbus Survey? For the uninitiated, the Columbus Survey is known by many as the annual census of the community foundation field. It allows CF Insights to report on the state of the field through a snapshot of mostly financial data, although not exclusively financial data. And it's informed by the participation of community foundations across the country. Basing our reporting on our own reporting on self-reported data allows us to better customize the type of data and information that we collect, and it's informed by evolving conversations happening around the field. It allows us to collect data that's more up to date than what might usually be available using public sources of data. We primarily report on metrics that are related to asset-based metrics, gifts, as well as grants. But we also collect other data points related to expenses and revenues and the sources of each, staffing overall, and also by function, and more to give us an idea of some of the key differences between community foundations of different sizes and how those in different phases of their life cycle allocate resources. So what are the key findings of this year's Columbus Survey? We're actually going to explore those findings by logging on to the Columbus Survey results dashboard, which is a website that we built a couple of years ago. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to the browser in just a moment. Here we go. And you can get to these results by going to columbussurvey.cfinsights.org. And what's great about this website, and I'll say a little bit about the functionality of the site as I move through it, but essentially, for me and for us, the greatest victory of creating this website was that we can very easily update the data that's on here every year. And so instead of having to go through a repository of PDFs to get the different reports for every year, starting back in 2017 when we were reporting on 2016 data, all of this data started to be published right on this website. So you can switch from year to year and see the data for that specific fiscal year. And so I invite anyone who's listening today to explore the data and go back a couple of years. And of course, the reporting on 2015 and earlier is available in PDF form on our website. So let's spend a moment highlighting the makeup of our sample, without whom this reporting would just not be possible. So of course we thank the 250 plus community foundations from across the country who helped us by participating in this survey. These community foundations come from all around the country. They're different sizes, different ages, different geographies. They serve different communities, and they all participated in this effort by collecting the standard set of data that we collect. So if you explore the website, you're going to see that a lot of these charts are interactive, so you can just hover over some of these visualizations to see the data that sort of drives those visualizations. And I just want to focus really quickly on the Midwest. As is always the case, we had strong representation from here, from the set of states, and this is where more than half of our sample actually operates. But I do also want to especially call out the members of the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, all of the members of the alliance participate in the survey every year, and this year was no exception. You'll probably also notice this, but our Midwest respondents as a whole, some of them tend to be, on the smaller side. There are a lot of smaller community foundations in a few of these states. And so even though we have a little bit more than half of our sample coming from this region, they together hold less than a third of the assets within our sample. And by contrast, if I hovered over the Western region, you'll see that there are relatively fewer participants from one of these states, and although about 13% of our sample is from here, they hold over a quarter of the assets that are managed by our sample. This region, of course, is going to be home to several of the largest community foundations in the country, so that's probably not a huge surprise to many. And as always, we also see good representation of community foundations serving communities of different sizes. So we broke this down by different category of population size. This is the population of the service area that the community foundation covers. And we broke this down into several fairly specific categories. And you can see that there's a healthy split among almost all of them. We have, from those community foundations that serve fewer than 10,000 people in their service area to just a couple who serve more than 10 million who reported on this or who contributed to the survey this year. And as I mentioned, there's a good split among all of these different groups. And we also have a healthy spread of respondents by asset size cohort. So you can just hover over, or I guess it's all visible right here on the page. You can just hover over and have it react to your mouse pointer. But there's as I mentioned, a pretty good split here, and no cohort was represents less than 10% of our entire sample. And it's important to keep these different categories in mind. Less than $25 million in assets, from 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 250, 250 to 500, and over 500, since many of our analyses are organized by these different groups, as you'll see when we move through the different sections of the site. Speaking of which, let's go to the next section and dive into some of the data that all of these community foundations reported. So let's focus here on the total reported assets, gifts, and grants. Collectively, our full sample held $86.8 billion in assets, received about $10.5 billion in gifts, and granted out close to $9 billion in grants. A couple of things I want to point out here. You can, again, hover over some of these visualizations and see the more specific dollar amounts where applicable. But as for the data itself, what I want to point out First is that this is actually the first time our sample collectively reported raising more than $10 billion in gifts. So it was a pretty active year for fundraising for at least those who make up the our 250 community foundation sample. And the other is that the collective asset total is only slightly what it was in 2017. And this effective flattening, you could say, of asset growth is reflected in the median change. So for our respondents, the median change of or median growth in assets was less than 1%. So, and additional to that, close to half of our respondents, about 48%, have reported some sort of decrease from their fiscal year 2017 asset totals. These decreases are, for the most part, not super significant. We're not talking about huge drops in asset levels. Only 6 respondents out of our entire sample reported an asset decrease of more than 10%, but it is reflective of the market slowdown we observed, or that everyone's observed really, especially near the end of the year, which affected investments in endowed assets. And volatile market conditions in particular are reflected in the stark difference that you won't see on this site, but I'll speak to the difference between community foundations operating on a calendar year basis, whose median change rate was minus 4% in assets, versus those who operate with a June or earlier fiscal year end date. Some of the lingering conditions from 2017, of course, carrying over, and their median change was a 9% increase. And so if we focus on the top or the largest 100 community foundations in the country, this actually tracks here as well. And you're going to see a much larger jump from 2016 to 2017 relative to the slight jump from 2017 to 2018. And the reason we highlight the largest 100 community foundations by assets in this visualization specifically is because it's the best way to get a steady longitudinal view of overall trends. So we have a consistent sample that we can then track over a longer period of time. And now we're going to focus on the change rates in gift and grant activity. And so, I actually skipped something. I wanted to mention gifts and grants for the top 100 as well. Because what's interesting about these two different data points is that you'll see that there's a steadier rate of growth. Gifts are, actually I'll turn off grants, it'll be easier to see. You see gifts have continued their pretty steady growth trajectory from 2015 for this group. And if I switch over to grants, you're gonna see that there's an even longer trend of growth from about 2012 to where it is now in 2018 for this group. And for both categories, gifts and grants, gifts received, grants out, it was about an 8% median increase for both of these metrics for the largest 100 in the country. So now we're going to zoom back out to the entire sample, not just the top or the largest 100, but everyone who contributed to our sample, and look at the change rates of gifts and grants. The median increase in gift totals was 8% from last year, and nearly a third of our respondents, if I hover over this dark green bar here, saw fundraising totals increase by more than half from their 2017 totals. So that's the definition of dramatic increase in this context, is whether the gift totals for the respondents increased by 50% or more. And if you want to see the definitions for all of these different categories, so what does a moderate increase mean, what does a neutral increase mean, you can hover over this tooltip and there's a breakdown of what we mean by those different categories. Gifts tend to be a little bit more unpredictable than grant making generally. If a community foundation receives a large one-time gift, or there's the realization of a bequest that's larger, they might see a huge jump in their fundraising totals in one year, which will result in them being added to this dramatic increase. But then the following year, if they return to levels that is more akin to their historical trends, it might look like a dramatic decrease when it's really a return to a previous level of gifts. But in contrast to fundraising and in contrast to gifts received, grant making tends to be a lot more steady actually from year to year. You're going to see a much higher proportion of respondents in the neutral and moderate buckets. So altogether, from moderate decrease, which is give or take 10% to neutral to give or take 20%, neutral, give or take 10%, and moderate increase, give or take 20%. They're all going to be in one of these three categories, and altogether they make up about 85% of our sample. So for the most part, you're not going to see quite the dramatic change for these folks. But I do also want to point out that in the aggregate, the median change in grants is 10%, which is a bit of a higher rate than fundraising. And that's the median for the entire field there. Let's jump over to the next section, all about different fund types and asset types. This is a focus on endowed and non-endowed assets. You're not going to see all these categories add up to 100% because we report on medians and not averages for many of these. And so some of these categories are not going to add up quite to 100%. Just as a quick clarifying note, if that gets noticed. So one thing I do want to point out, and this is something that holds true every year, and it's a key difference, or one of the key differences between operating models at community foundations of varying asset sizes, is that typically you're going to see a higher proportion of pass-through funds from community foundations that are on the larger side, whereas the smaller and growing community foundations, which might also be newer, they might have been established more recently, they might be more focused on asset growth. And so they're going to have a higher proportion of endowed assets there. Whereas the larger community foundations will be looking to maintain a diversified, flexible set of donor products, and they'll be doing that through bringing in more pass-through assets, non-endowed assets. As you're going to see in just a little bit, that's going to get reflected in differences in distribution rate by asset size as well, but this is not, of course, the only factor that plays into that. But just keep that in mind, that the larger community foundations do tend to have more pass-through assets. And this is a look at the sort of a high-level version of a product mix at community foundations. There are obviously many more products besides donor-advised funds and discretionary funds, but to keep things simple here, these are the two that we focus on. And so for the most part, you're going to see the average community foundation that's on the smaller side have fewer assets, or a lower asset proportion of assets in donor advised funds. So on average, the community foundations under $25 million, as you see here, are have about 11% of their assets in donor advised funds. But if I jump to the largest group of community foundations, that is the community foundations that are over $500 million, they have more than a third of their assets on average in their donor advised funds. DAPs, of course, provide a flexible vehicle for donors to exercise their philanthropy, and tend to be pretty highly active grant-making funds, which is another factor that plays into the distribution rate differences we'll see in a moment. And also, this is actually a good chance for me to point this out as well, as far as functionality of the site itself is concerned. You don't have to click through all of these different categories to see what the data are for each of these different cohorts. You can just swap to a table, and everything is right there in front of you, so you can just very quickly see that we have, again, the smaller community foundations with 11% of their assets in DAFs on average, and the larger 34%, and everybody in between. This year, we added a couple of additional data points to the site that focus on donor advised funds specifically. They, of course, are an immensely popular vehicle for philanthropy for donors, and they're also a topic of conversation in many circles. So we wanted to make sure that we had the data here, so we wanted to make sure that we made it available to as many people as we could. And so let's start with the basic asset gift and grant totals for donor advised funds. So this is, again, our entire sample collectively reported about $30.6 billion in assets in DAPs, close to $6 billion received as gifts, and close to $5.5 billion went back out as grants. If you recall the overall totals I mentioned earlier, for the entire field for all fund types, you'll probably come to the conclusion, which is true, that dApps accounted for more than half of gift and grant activity. So, gifts it was $10.5 billion and 6 billion, or close to 6 billion, went to dApps, and a, a little under $9 billion for grants, and $5.4 billion of those came from dApps as well. The other data point that we added, and I'll move the page down a little bit to get a better view, is the flow rate of dApps. And I actually do want to spend a moment here because this is a newer data point that we've added to the site, and I want to make sure that I define it. So the basic premise of it is that it shows the proportion of aggregate grant dollars out in relation to gift dollars that were received. Or very basically, it's total gifts divided by total grants. And so this is not necessarily going to tell you how many of the same dollars received in a given year are going back out that same year, but it does portray a high rate of grant making that keeps in close pace with fundraising. So put another way, the median DAF flow rate in 2018 for all respondents was 82.6%, meaning that for every dollar given to a DAF, 82.6 cents went back out to support a philanthropic cause. So this means that although a lot of funds were raised by DAFs, a lot of funds were also given by DAFs. And if you see here on the right, if we focus on just the largest community foundations, the median was 100%. So that means that half of that specific group granted out a higher dollar total from their DAFs than they received in 2018. So again, this is all in the aggregate. And we're not talking about the same dollars that are going in that are going back out, but it's part of that larger pool of DAFs in the aggregate for the entire sample. So I highly suggest that you check out the research of two individuals, Dan Heist and Danielle Vance McMullen. They're cited here on the site. Their paper was called Understanding Donor Advised Funds, How Grants Flow During Recessions, where they define the flow rate at length and describe how DAFs remain active grant makers during economic downturns. And you can find summaries of their research online as well. And I think I need to check myself. I feel like I might have misspoken, said it was gifts divided by grants. It's the other way around. It's grants divided by gifts. So apologies. That's the flow rate. Grants divided by gifts. So earlier I mentioned that larger community foundations tend to have more assets in non-endowed funds. They tend to have more assets in DAFs. And that's going to be reflected here, where the median distribution rate also tends to increase for the most part with asset size, or it trends upward. And this is going to be highly dependent on the level of endowment, the different, the actual and specific fund type breakdown at these individual community foundations. But for the most part, that's going to be the trend you're going to see. I also mentioned earlier how DAF fundraising and grant making by DAFs made up more than half of the overall totals for our sample. So for every one of our asset size cohorts, the distribution rate of DAFs is well above the community foundation as a whole. The difference is going to start to widen as I go and go from smaller community foundations to larger, because there is just a higher proportion of assets that are in DAPs. So that the sort of difference is going to start to grow a little bit. Based on all of this data, the flow rate, the distribution rate, and even just the aggregate totals of gifts and grants, it's easy to say that DAPs move a lot of dollars, and they absolutely do. But I do want to stress that this is all in the aggregate. And it doesn't quite say enough about individual DAPs on the account level, whether there's a high level of activity of some DAPs, maybe masking lower level of activity in others. So because our data only collects aggregate totals, more detailed research would have to happen into the activity of individual DAF accounts on the account level to be able to say more about the activity of individual DAFs. But in the aggregate, DAFs are just very, very highly active grant-making vehicles. Let's go to our next section here and move specifically down to surplus versus subsidy. Using this visualization, we track how operating revenues and expenses relate to each other, showing the proportion of our respondents for whom operating expenses exceeded revenues and vice versa. The breakdown of percentages here, so the proportion of our respondents that are in these different categories who had their expenses significantly higher than their revenues in 2018, and those whose revenues were significantly higher than their expenses in 2018, those proportions are not all that different from last year. All of these different categories moved very slightly within 1 or 2 percentage points from 2017. So this pattern basically holds. And for the most part, having an at least modest surplus is going to provide some potentially important flexibility to reinvest that surplus into other areas that are of importance to the community foundation. So as operating budgets have grown across the field, the median increase for our sample was about a 6.5% increase from fiscal year 2017. Operating revenues have also kept pace for many, which is why, again, this breakdown is pretty similar to what it was last year. But if we took these 5 categories and rolled them up into 2 very simple categories, did you generate surplus revenue or did you operate at an operating revenue deficit? 73% of our respondents generated some amount of surplus revenue. But for any whose expenses exceeded revenues, that would be the subsidy group. This again will have, for those folks, unrestricted funds are typically going to cover those gaps, those operating gaps. But it will have implications for how flexible the community foundation is to invest in other areas of importance to them, like community leadership. And I just mentioned this, but just to kind of reiterate, operating budgets have grown across the field. The median, again, was about 6.5%. But if you consider that asset size did not grow for many, or did to a very small degree, it's not going to be completely surprising that the expense to asset ratio has crept up for a number of these different asset size cohorts from 2017. So for half of these 6 cohorts, so for 3 of them, their medians are up very slightly from 2017, although the overall median still remains 1.2%. So essentially, it's the expenses divided by assets here. So it used to be that the standard for the expense to asset ratio was about 1%. That was sort of the standard that a lot of folks aimed for, but that's not something that many have tried to stick as close to in recent years, as there's been an increase in investment in leadership work in special initiatives. But it is a sort of short form way to see how lean the operations of a community foundation are. And we're going to transition away from this site in just a moment and go back to the slides. But I did want to mention that we also have 4 different sorted lists that are basically ranked by 4 different data points. We have our respondents by assets, our respondents by distribution rate, by number of transactions. This is number of gift and grant transactions, and gifts per capita. There's a lot of functionality here. You can click on the name of any one of these community foundations to see where they rank on all 4 of their lists. If you are interested in a particular community foundation, or you are a part of that community foundation, a staff member there, you can very easily share your rankings via the share tools here. So on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you could just email a link directly to this window of your rankings to a colleague of yours and share your rankings that way. And another change we made this year is that we used to report on the top 100 of, I'll go to assets here, but we used to report on just the largest 100 in each of these categories. Starting this year, we're actually going to just feature everyone who responded to the survey. So you're going to get down to 250, 251, and you're going to be able to see what everybody reported for each of these different data points and how they sort and how they relate to the other community foundations who responded to the survey. And one other piece of functionality that I do want to mention, which I think is probably best demonstrated on one of the visual tabs, is that the entire site is very printer friendly. We formatted it this way intentionally. This is a way, because we no longer offer a PDF version of our report, this was a way for folks to still be able to generate a PDF version of the website. So it has all the data that you can find on each one of the pages. You can either print it as a PDF, or you could just print it directly on paper and hand it out to colleagues. And just use it that way. So we intentionally formatted it that way, and at the same time, there are a handful of visualizations that are interactive in nature. So you have to hover over the different wedges of the donut chart, or need to toggle data to be able to see everyone. So in those instances, we just featured everybody in the data table to just make it easier, so that it's printer friendly and it's all available on a single page. So I'm going to go back and switch back over to my slide deck and talk a little bit about how CF Insights data can help you. I'm just going to look for that slide. Okay. So now that we talked about the high-level findings of the Columbus survey, how can this data help you specifically? For the most part, the data that I presented is in the aggregate. That's all of the data that's there except for the ranking lists there. Everything else is in the aggregate, rolled up by asset size cohort or geography, or a different way. But all of that data is also obviously available on the individual community foundations as well. We house all that on our CF Insights database. You can log onto our database and run any of the reports that are listed here, and a good handful of other ones. We have over 90 reports in total on our database. So this is just a quick selection of some of the reports that are available there. The best way to access all the data that we have on peers and everyone else who reported their data as part of the Columbus survey on a benchmarking report is to join CF Insights as a member. Although, of course, as a participant in the Columbus survey itself, even if you're not a member, there is a selection of reports that is available to you, as well as being featured on one of those sorted lists. And you can see how you relate to other community foundations that way as well. As a member, you can build your peer group to your specifications. So this is just a quick snapshot of what the database actually looks like. It runs on a simple Boolean search. So you can create ranges. You can ensure that only exact matches are pulled into your peer group, or based on where they are, their fiscal year end date, where they're how old they are as a community foundation. So you can find similarly sized peers by assets, but it doesn't have to be the only way you search either, of course. And although our reports and our peer group creation search tool that I just showed on the previous slide, all of that is set up to be self-serve. So if you're a member, you can query your peers on your own. You can run all the reports on your own as well. But it doesn't mean that you're on your own to determine who your best peers might be, or that you're on your own to run those reports either, of course. So we're happy to work with you to define a set of peers that are most relevant to you. And in addition to all of the self-serve reports that are available on our database, we also build peer benchmarking dashboards like the one you see here for you. And it's usually going to be used as a table setting snapshot that compares your community foundation to up to 5 peers of ultimately your choosing, to help set the table for a board meeting or some other conversation that you're having internally. These dashboards can also be customized to your liking. So if there's a report that you want to swap one of these out for, if you want to have an additional slide added to your dashboard with additional reporting, or even see different reports on different sets of peers, we can work with you to make sure that the dashboard that you receive is most relevant to your staff and board. And along with this visualization, we also send along a set of analytical bullet points that help sort of contextualize your data and your peers' data compared and contrasted with the rest of the field, to help provide additional context, so you're not just looking at the visual and left to come to conclusions just from that. So I'm going to show just a couple of the on-demand reports that you can run. That was a dashboard. We create that for you. These are the types of reports that you can run on your own. And so one quick example is this is a report showing full-time equivalents, FTEs, by function, so staffing by function at different community foundations, along with the median and the mean for each category. So here on the left side, you're going to see the total, and each one of these additional columns is going to have a breakdown of how many FTEs folks have on staff for these different functions at the community foundation. Key differences here are going to just help you understand how your peers allocate capacity across different functions, and they can help you make the case for needed capacity in a specific area once you cross-tabulate this with some other factors as well. You can use our database to load visual reports showing how you and your peers compare. It's usually going to be in the form of a standard bar or line chart. But it's not just the visualization either. So, if you loaded this report and you're curious to know, if there's a community foundation in this group that processed a very high number of gifts, or if you're thinking about streamlining that process, or maybe you saw a community foundation's DAF gift total take a huge jump from one year to the next, and you want to know if the number of contributions they received is reflective of maybe a few unusually large gifts, or even one unusually large gift. You can also run the raw data for any of the reports that are available on our database. And we can also help you create customized versions of these reports as well, visually or adding in additional data. So this is an example of what that looks like. The previous slide was the visual. This is the raw data. And so you can uncover some of that additional context as well to see, okay, exactly what data made up that visualization that I just loaded. And this is all available to you on the website that you can run on any time. And I should have mentioned this before, but all of these reports also run on live data. So the very latest data that we have available is going to be driving this. So if a community foundation signed on today and was not a part of the Columbus survey, but they reported their data and they happen to be a part of your peer group, you can load your report tomorrow, and you're going to see that community foundation as part of your peer group. And another thing I want to mention as well is that all of these different reports are exportable, so you can go ahead and export this into an Excel or a PDF, either the data or the visualization for distribution internally or to work with offline. So when you build a peer group on our database, that's the screenshot up here, you can add as many data points as you want. So as you add more data points, every time you add a data point, the page refreshes and shows you a data table featuring all the peers that fit your criteria, along with the specific data that you queried. So in this example, I wanted foundation gross assets, DAF assets, number of donor advised funds, and a couple of other data points that I just cut for space, but urban versus rural, if they work in an urban area or a rural area. And I also wanted community foundations that have more than 100,000 folks in their service area. All of those would be featured on the website. So all of those would be pulled in if you create your own peer group on the database. And like our individual reports, you can also export the table into Excel. So for instance, this is the results of that data query or that peer query, and all of these foundations fit my criteria. And I exported this into Excel that I made into a custom table. And you can use that Excel, of course, to make your own visualizations. If you want to add it to a presentation and need to format it in a specific way that's standard to your style, all of that data is available to you to be worked with and used in a presentation that you create yourself. And as always, we're always ready to help with determining who your peers are, helping you run some of those queries for your peers, so we can help you figure out the best way to combine some of those different criteria to make a peer group that's relevant to you. And we can always also help you customize some of the visuals that you want to add to a presentation as well. All you have to do is ask, and we're happy to help. So how can you be a part of all of this? How can you be a part of the Columbus Survey Snapshot? How can you get access to those reports that I mentioned? And you can do this in two different ways, and they're both super simple. The first is participating in our Columbus survey, of course. You can join our e-news list by going on our website, cfinsights.org, and you can sign up right there to make sure that you receive all communications about the Columbus survey, when to participate, and everything else that we announce throughout the year, including new reports and registrations for webinars and everything else that we're doing throughout the year. To be clear, you absolutely do not need to be a member of CF Insights to participate. We invite the entire field to participate in the Columbus survey. That will get your community foundation listed on the data list tab that I showed earlier on the website to see how you compare on that list. And you will also get access to a handful of basic benchmarking reports on our database. If you need help setting up a database account, you can reach out directly to me, and I'll be displaying my contact information in just a little while. And the other is just to ask us questions. Just reach out. We're happy to help however we can. We want to know what's relevant to the field. And the best way for us to do that is to learn directly from those who are in the field. And I get to do that throughout the year through conferences and conversations I have with those in the field. But just know that I'm a phone call or an email away. So we're happy to figure out how we can make our data most relevant to you and to the wider field as well. If you're interested in starting a membership, I'm always happy to give you a full guided tour as well. So just reach out anytime. So what's next from CF Insights? We had the Columbus survey through most of the first half of the year. We're happy to make those results available to the entire field, but there are other efforts underway that I'm really excited about, and I can't wait to say more about, but I'll say just a little bit about for now. We are actively developing a set of metrics to help community foundations track their community leadership work. These metrics were adapted from the CF Leads framework of community leadership and in close consultation with CF Leads. And these were developed to inform specific practices and strategies and should contribute to in-depth conversation and decision-making at your community foundation as you embark on your leadership journey or want to go to the next phase of your leadership journey. And the other thing we're working on, also closely with CF Leads, is on a new survey to learn how the changing political, social, economic climate are all informing the work of community foundations. This survey is currently in development, and we're going to be launching that to the entire field pretty soon. We want responses from as many in the field as we can get. So please do keep an eye out for more about the survey from us and from CF Leads. And we will be looking to communicate much more about this in the next several weeks. And so that brings me to Q&A. We're going to transition to our Q&A period, and I'm going to display my contact information here for a moment. But in the meantime, I'm going to throw it back to Elizabeth, who I believe collected some questions.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate you walking us through all of that data. I think that was really helpful. As David mentioned, we are awaiting any of the questions that you have for David to field. One of the ones that we did get early on was whether or not this information could be presented on as a conference or anything of that nature. So what would be the best route to take if someone is interested in sharing this data, whether options for members and then options for not members if they did want to, share more of the findings of the Columbus survey with others?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So the best way to learn about using the data, it's probably going to be on a case-by-case basis, so you can reach out directly to me. I'll put my contact information back on the screen actually. And if it's the aggregate data, so anything from the website, feel free to share it at a conference. Just make sure to mention where it's from, so make sure to cite us. And that's totally fine. When it comes to the individual community foundation data, we will have to work with you on that. We don't really share individual community foundation data unless it's something that would otherwise be available publicly anyway. So we can work with you to make sure it's in a style that sort of maybe fits the Columbus survey in a way, or might make it clear that it's from the Columbus survey or something like that. So if if you were going to use individual community foundation data, I would suggest that you just reach out to me. If you wanted to share your own community foundations, rankings and all of that, those lists are publicly available, so you can always just query those because anybody can see those at any time. Um, so yeah, I hope that's helpful for now. But yeah, I guess the best rule of thumb would be to reach out.
Thanks, David. We have a really great question that came in here from Chris, and he wants to know how the information is rolled together. Is it by fiscal year or is it by calendar year?
Yeah, that's we do it by fiscal year. So yeah, so for 2018, we had community foundations with fiscal year ends of January, March, June, September, and December. Um, so yeah, all of the data that's presented is from community foundations that are in that fiscal year. Um, and not on the calendar year. And so that informs some of the different breakouts as well. I mentioned it for the asset growth, but I'm more than happy, if you have a question and you're curious about the aggregate of community foundations that operate on a calendar year specifically for any one of the data points, I'm happy to provide that as well. But yeah, we do it by fiscal year.
Thanks, David. And Rita has a really great question about actually working with her local community foundation. On CF Insights, do we actually provide information on how to work with your specific local community foundation, or are there other resources that you recommend that Rita reach out to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So connecting folks with community foundations, again, I think you can certainly reach out to me. We have, a number of community foundations that we're in regular touch with. So, if it makes sense to make a connection, we're happy to help do that if we can. But we also do have a number of other resources here at Candid that can sort of help you get information about community foundations as it relates to um, local working nonprofits, if it's related to fundraising or anything like that. We have a number of trainings. If you go to grantspace.org, there's a calendar of trainings that speak specifically to how to work with your local community foundation. We actually did a webinar on that earlier this year. I'm sure we could follow up with information about that, which was recorded, about how to work with your local community foundation and how to reach out to them and who your first point of contact might be. But yeah, I would say that's the first place to check. But we do have a number of resources at candid.org, grantspace.org, and elsewhere on our website that speaks specifically to reaching out to your local community foundation. But again, I do get to converse with a number of them, and so if it makes sense to make a connection, I'll certainly help if I can.
Thanks, David. So Will has a question here, and I think it might be helpful to actually jump back onto the site. And he wants to know how you could easily print, either the top 100 list, or when he's looking at his foundation and its aggregates, how to actually print those aspects. So is it when we do actually want to print the information that's on the website, can you specify which data we're actually printing from, or is it going to pull out the full PDF?
Yeah, good question. You have a couple of different options. So to print out the lists, it works the same way as any one of the other tabs on the website. If you just go um, to either any one of the data lists that you want to print, you can just print it like anything else, and it'll again also be printer friendly. So you can see the entire list here, and it's all formatted in a way that would just fit um, on a standard size paper. Um, the other way to get specific data, so there's of course what's available here. It would take maybe a little bit of legwork to get it, but you can also download the data that's available on every tab. It's not going to give you the disaggregated data for the first 4 sections, but I'll just demonstrate this very quickly actually. You could download the data to Excel from the data lists, and it will show you all the data just in a typical Excel file. So you can just see that same data that's available there. It's all of everything that's within a certain tab on the website is going to get added to the same Excel file. So if you noticed, I happened to be sitting on the asset ranking list, but when I downloaded the data into Excel, it features all the data for all of the different lists. And so this works on all of the tabs. It'll download all of the data that feeds all of the tables that are on that individual tab. And then another option that you have, which I should have mentioned before, on the bottom, this is sort of a universal link, so it doesn't matter which tab you happen to be on. If you click access the data for all community foundations or participating community foundations, that'll into Excel, it'll put the assets, the gifts, and the grants for all of the respondents as well, and their fiscal year end date. So you can just really quickly see um, those three different data points. For other data points, again, I would reach out and we could see if we can do something for you, especially if it's your data. You can, as I mentioned, if you're not a member, there are some reports that you can run as a non-member. It'll show your data, but it'll compare you to an aggregate. So you'll be able to get your own data, but the comparison is going to be in the aggregate. So that's another way to see your data.
Thanks, David. I think that was actually really helpful just to kind of walk through that a little bit. Eleanor is asking, there's quite a few community foundations nowadays. So is there anything that the field and other practitioners in the social sector can do to help increase the sample size of the Columbus survey?
Oh, I was muted. Sorry, I was speaking to I don't know if I was heard there. So let me just start that again. Yeah, I would just say to help us spread the word. So we have a Twitter account at CF Insights. So you can just retweet us, quote tweet us, help spread the word that way. We have a newsletter. So I would just, let folks know to go to cfinsights.org and sign up for the newsletter from there. But yeah, we endeavor to grow the sample every year. We do get a high level of overlap from year to year, so uh, it's pretty consistent from year to year who it is who's participating in the survey. And we do get some who participate one year and not in another, a pretty small handful actually. But yeah, I would just say take the social media and forward our email when we announce it, which is typically going to be in the first quarter of the year, to as many colleagues as you can.
Thanks, David. We got it on the second try. Jennifer has a really great question. So I'm wondering if this is actually a data point that you look into as part of the Columbus survey. Does any of the data tell us how much of the grant making is board discretionary or otherwise competitively offered to grantees?
Yeah, that's a good question. As part of this survey, no. Um, yeah, we kind of for the purposes of reporting, we have the different categories that roll up for most of the fields. We collect the total for the entire foundation, of course, and then we break it out by discretionary grant making and by donor advised. But in the discretionary bucket, we don't differentiate between board directed and competitive grant making, at least currently. We're always taking feedback for how to improve the survey, so that could be a really interesting data point for us to explore in the future. I just will mention very quickly that we do collect some of this data on other fund types on our database. We tend to do that only on our members because it makes the survey just a little bit more, it just takes a little bit longer to complete this level of detail, but we do collect some data on agency funds, field of interest, scholarships, geo-affiliates, just to name a few.
Thank you. And we have a bit more of a technical question here. So for other people that are working with data, could you speak to the type of program or software that we use to power the CF Insights website?
Sure, yeah, I could speak to at least the reports. The reports are built in Crystal Reports, just a data visualization tool. It just runs on a server. So basically the way it's set up is that it queries our database that um, the Boolean search is sort of run on a SQL server. And so basically what you do when you're on there is you're creating a custom data report for the most part, right? So if you're looking for community foundations between 100 and $150 million in assets with a fiscal year end date of, June 30th, 2018, it'll pull all of the community foundations that fit those criteria. And then when you run the reports, it's Crystal Reports that's querying, or I should say, using the community foundations that were pulled into your peer query and searching for the data points that comprise the actual benchmarking report that you select. So, if you have a peer query that gives you 5 community foundations, and you didn't try to pull in DAF assets into that specific peer query, you could still go to the reports section and run a DAF-related report, and it's going to take the list of the community foundations that you came up with, and it'll generate the report and query the data that was not pulled into your search, into your Boolean search.
Well, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate you taking us through the report, letting us know how to actually work through all the data on our own when we actually get that, the downloads and print them, as well as just, understanding the difference of where we're looking at averages, where we're looking at the top 100, when we're looking at medians, and how to actually make sense of that data. I want to say thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Rest assured you will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar session. We very much appreciate your feedback, so do let us know what you thought of today's webinar. If you did like today's webinar, we hope that you join us again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.